Angie Dodge. On the night of June 13, 1996, 18-year-old Angie Dodge was found deceased in her Idaho Falls apartment. The crime scene revealed she had been attacked in a manner that shocked even experienced investigators. What made this case particularly devastating was not just the tragedy itself, but the cascade of injustice that would follow for more than 2 decades. Initial investigations led detectives to Christopher Tapp, whose coerced confession would send him to prison for 20 years. However, the DNA evidence collected from the scene never matched Tapp, a fact that should have exonerated him from the beginning. The real perpetrator, Brian Lee Dripps Sr., lived directly across the street from Angie's apartment and had been briefly interviewed early in the investigation before being dismissed as a suspect. Dripps later admitted he had been under the influence at the time and his intentions did not include taking a life. Yet for years, he watched an innocent man pay for his actions while he remained free. The investigation remained stagnant for decades, with Tapp maintaining his innocence despite the confession that had been extracted from him through questionable interrogation methods. The breakthrough came in 2018, when investigators turned to genetic genealogy, a revolutionary forensic technique that uses public DNA databases to identify suspects through family connections. Using GED match, investigators built a family tree that eventually led them to the Ussery family line and ultimately to Dripps. When detectives approached Dripps in 2019, they collected DNA from a discarded cigarette butt. The match was conclusive. Faced with undeniable evidence, Dripps confessed to acting alone in Angie's death. He provided details that only the true perpetrator could have known, details that had never matched Tapp's coerced statements. In February 2021, Dripps entered a guilty plea. 3 months later, Judge Joel Tingy sentenced him to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 20 years. During the sentencing hearing, Dripps offered an apology, stating that what happened was never his intention. But Angie's mother, Carol Dodge, who had spent years fighting to prove Tapp's innocence, made her feelings clear. "I can't forgive you, ever," she told him in court. The judge had harsh words for the original investigators as well. Addressing the failures that led to Tapp's wrongful conviction, Judge Tingy stated, "A young man spent a significant part of his life in prison for no good reason. That falls on you." Tapp was eventually awarded an $11.4 million settlement for the years stolen from him. The case sparked intense debate about the use of public DNA databases for criminal investigations and the ethical boundaries of genetic genealogy. But one Washington case would reveal an even more tragic ending. Jody Loomis. On August 23, 1972, 20-year-old Jody Loomis set out on her bicycle to visit the stables near Mill Creek, Washington. The route took her through a rural, wooded area, a peaceful setting that would become the scene of her final moments. When Jody failed to return home, her family's worst fears were confirmed. She had been attacked and shot, her life cut short in an act that would remain unsolved for nearly 5 decades. The investigation in the early 1970s faced significant limitations. Forensic science was in its infancy, and while physical evidence was collected from the scene, including biological material found on Jody's boot, the technology to analyze it properly did not yet exist. Detectives pursued numerous leads over the years, but the case eventually went cold. The evidence sat in storage, waiting for science to catch up with justice. That moment came in 2018 when investigators revisited the case using genetic genealogy. The biological evidence recovered from Jody's boot was submitted for advanced DNA testing, yielding a profile that was then uploaded to GED match. The genealogical search led investigators to a family tree that pointed toward Terrence Miller, a lifelong resident of Snohomish County who lived just 5 miles from where Jody was found. Miller was in his 20s at the time of the incident and had been operating a ceramic shop from his garage while navigating 2 divorces and raising 3 daughters. Investigators needed a definitive DNA match to move forward. They obtained it in an unassuming way, collecting a discarded coffee cup that Miller had used. The DNA from the cup matched the evidence from the crime scene with odds of 980 million to 1. Miller was arrested in 2019. During the investigation, records revealed he had prior incidents involving inappropriate behavior, though nothing that had connected him to Jody's case until now. As the trial date approached, Miller was released on bail. The trial in November 2020 focused heavily on the DNA evidence, with the defense attempting to challenge the handling and preservation of evidence over nearly 50 years. What happened next shocked everyone involved in the case. Hours before the jury returned with a guilty verdict, Miller took his own life. The jury was unaware of his death when they delivered their decision, finding him guilty of Jody's demise. There would be no sentencing, no opportunity for Jody's family to address him in court, no true closure. Detective Jim Scharf later reflected on the tragic end, stating that Terry Miller controlled his own fate. Jody's sister was left to process both the validation of the verdict and the hollow feeling of justice deferred. "How could this happen?" she asked, speaking for a family that had waited nearly 50 years only to be denied the final chapter. The next case would take even longer to solve. Lindy Sue Beekler. December 5, 1975, began as an ordinary day for 19-year-old Lindy Sue Beekler in Manor Township, Pennsylvania. She had been out running errands, purchasing groceries for her apartment. When Lindy returned home that afternoon, someone was waiting. The groceries she had just purchased were found still unpacked when her body was discovered. She had been attacked repeatedly, suffering 19 stab wounds in what investigators believed was a targeted act. The investigation began immediately, but detectives struggled to identify a clear suspect. The crime scene yielded biological evidence, but in 1975, DNA analysis was decades away from practical use. Police Chief Donald W. Sheeler admitted years later, "We actually don't have a thing at this time," reflecting the frustration of working a case with evidence they could not yet use. The case grew cold, becoming Lancaster County's oldest unsolved case. Adding to the mystery, there were strange elements that investigators could never quite piece together. Early in the investigation, someone vandalized the apartment where Lindy was found, though the motive remained unclear. There were also rumors of a lost confession letter, something that true crime enthusiasts debated for years on forums, but nothing concrete ever surfaced. The case seemed destined to remain unsolved. The breakthrough came in 2022, nearly 47 years after Lindy's passing. Investigators partnered with Parabon Nano Labs, a company specializing in genetic genealogy, to develop a new approach to the cold case. The DNA evidence preserved from the scene was analyzed using advanced techniques, and genealogists began building family trees to identify potential suspects. The process was painstaking, working through distant relatives and complex family connections. The investigation led them to David Sinopoli, a man with Italian heritage traced back to Gasparina. Remarkably, Sinopoli had lived in the same apartment complex as Lindy at the time of her passing. Yet he had never been identified as a person of interest in the original investigation. Detectives needed to confirm the genealogical lead with a direct DNA sample. Their opportunity came at an airport when Sinopoli discarded a coffee cup. The DNA from that cup matched the biological evidence left at the crime scene decades earlier. Sinopoli was arrested in July 2022. Faced with the DNA evidence, he entered a guilty plea in October 2023 to third-degree unlawful actions, assault, and burglary. He received a sentence of up to 50 years in prison. The resolution brought some measure of peace to Lindy's family and the community, though questions about Sinopoli's motive and why he targeted Lindy remain largely unanswered. The case highlighted how new genealogical approaches could overcome the challenge of distant DNA matches, opening doors to solve cases that had seemed impossible just years before. One case from Washington would draw national attention. Jennifer Bastian. August 4, 1986, was supposed to be a day of simple childhood freedom. Jennifer Bastian, just 13 years old, asked her parents if she could ride her bike through Point Defiance Park in Tacoma, Washington. It was a place she knew well, a local treasure where families felt safe. Her parents agreed, not knowing that their daughter would never return home. When Jennifer failed to come back that evening, the park became the center of a massive search operation. Nearly a month later, Jennifer's body was discovered in a wooded area of the park. The investigation revealed she had been harmed and strangled, and investigators immediately suspected a connection to another local case involving Michelle Welch, who had met a similar fate just months earlier in a different Tacoma park. The similarities were striking, leading many to believe the same person was responsible for both tragedies. However, as DNA technology advanced, it would eventually prove that two different perpetrators had struck the Tacoma community. The investigation into Jennifer's case consumed thousands of hours. Detectives interviewed countless individuals, followed numerous leads, and collected evidence that would be preserved for future analysis. But despite their efforts, the perpetrator remained unidentified. Jennifer's mother, Patty Bastian, refused to let her daughter's case fade from memory. She and her family never gave up hope that one day they would learn who was responsible. That day came in 2018 when advances in DNA technology finally provided answers. Investigators developed a DNA profile from evidence collected at the scene and began the process of comparison testing. The profile eventually matched Robert D. Washburn, a man who had lived in Tacoma in 1986 but had since moved to Illinois. Interestingly, Washburn had actually contacted police years earlier to provide a tip about Michelle Welch's case, never imagining that his own DNA would one day link him to Jennifer's demise. When detectives approached Washburn, he voluntarily provided a DNA sample. The match was definitive. He was arrested and extradited to Washington to face charges. Washburn had no prior record of similar offenses, which had made him particularly difficult to identify through traditional investigative methods. His motive appeared to be opportunistic, taking advantage of a moment when Jennifer was alone in the park. In January 2019, Washburn entered a guilty plea and was sentenced to 27 years in prison. During the court proceedings, Jennifer's mother finally had the opportunity to address the man who had taken her daughter's life more than 3 decades earlier. "We never gave up on wanting justice," Patty Bastian told the court. The resolution of Jennifer's case, along with the separate solving of Michelle Welch's case, inspired Washington state lawmakers to pass Jennifer and Michelle's Law, which required DNA collection from individuals who pass away while under investigation. The law stands as a lasting tribute to 2 young lives lost and a tool to help solve future cases. Sometimes the smallest amount of DNA can solve the biggest mysteries. Stephanie Isaacson. On the morning of June 1st, 1989, 14-year-old Stephanie Isaacson left her Las Vegas home to walk to school. It was a routine she had done countless times, a short journey through her neighborhood that should have been uneventful. But Stephanie never made it to school that day. Her body was discovered later, and the investigation revealed she had been harmed and strangled. Another young life stolen in an act of senseless brutality. The Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department launched a thorough investigation. But despite their efforts, the case went cold. Physical evidence was collected, including biological material that investigators hoped would one day provide answers. However, the amount of DNA available was minimal, far less than what was typically needed for analysis using the technology available at the time. Lieutenant Ray Spencer, who worked the case, later recalled how it stayed with him throughout his career. "I constantly watched the news and still remembered it," he said, reflecting the personal investment investigators maintained even as years turned into decades. For 32 years, Stephanie's case remained unsolved. Her family lived with unanswered questions, and the community remembered a young person whose future had been violently cut short. The minimal DNA evidence sat in storage, too small to be useful with existing forensic methods. Traditional DNA analysis requires a certain threshold of genetic material to produce reliable results. And Stephanie's case fell below that threshold. Everything changed in 2021 when the case came to the attention of Othram, a laboratory specializing in cutting-edge genome sequencing technology. What made Othram unique was their ability to work with incredibly small amounts of DNA, far less than traditional labs required. The DNA sample from Stephanie's case measured just 0.12 nanograms, a record-setting low amount for this type of analysis. Through advanced genome sequencing techniques, Othram was able to develop a usable DNA profile. The analysis was made possible through a private donation specifically designated for Stephanie's case, highlighting how public support can directly impact cold case investigations. Once the profile was complete, investigators used genetic genealogy to build family trees and identify potential suspects. The investigation led them to Darren Roy Marchand, who had ended his own life in 1995. Marchand was also linked to another unsolved case from 1986, suggesting a pattern of behavior that had gone undetected during his lifetime. While there would be no trial or courtroom accountability due to Marchand's passing, the resolution provided crucial answers for Stephanie's family. They finally knew who was responsible and could begin to find some form of closure after more than 3 decades of uncertainty. Michael Vaughan from Othram emphasized the significance of the breakthrough, noting that DNA analysis is going to continue to improve, suggesting that even more cases with minimal evidence might soon be solvable. Stephanie's case demonstrated that no amount of DNA is too small for modern forensic science, offering hope to countless other families waiting for answers. Another case in Alaska would expose a different kind of failure. Jessica Baggin. May 4th, 1996 was a spring evening in Sitka, Alaska. 17-year-old Jessica Baggin was walking home along a familiar route, a bike path she had traveled many times before. When Jessica failed to arrive home, her family's concern quickly escalated to panic. The search for her ended in tragedy when her body was discovered. She had been harmed and strangled, another young person whose life was stolen in an act that devastated the small, tight-knit community of Sitka. The investigation that followed would become one of Alaska's most troubling examples of how justice can go terribly wrong. Under intense pressure to solve the case, investigators focused on Richard Bingham, subjecting him to lengthy interrogations that eventually produced a confession. However, Bingham's confession was later determined to have been coerced through questionable tactics. And when the case went to trial, he was acquitted. The DNA evidence from the scene did not match Bingham, Yet years would pass before investigators identified the true perpetrator. The real breakthrough came in 2020, more than 2 decades after Jessica's passing. Investigators partnered with Parabon Nanolabs to analyze DNA evidence using SNP profiling and genetic genealogy. The process involved building extensive family trees and identifying potential relatives of the unknown DNA profile. The investigation eventually led to Steve Branch, a man who had lived in Sitka in 1996, but had since relocated to Arkansas. Branch's name was not new to Sitka law enforcement. In 1996, just weeks before Jessica's passing, Branch had been indicted for a different incident involving inappropriate behavior. He had been acquitted in that case in 1997, and the connection to Jessica's case was not made at the time. When investigators approached Branch in 2020 with questions about Jessica, he denied any involvement and refused to provide a voluntary DNA sample. However, the investigation was already closing in. Through genetic genealogy, investigators had identified a relative of Branch's whose DNA showed kinship with the crime scene evidence. The genetic connection was strong enough to pursue Branch as the primary suspect. Before authorities could arrest him, Branch took his own life. An autopsy following his passing provided the DNA sample that confirmed what investigators had already concluded. Steve Branch was responsible for Jessica Baggins' demise. The resolution brought conflicting emotions to Sitka. The community had held a vigil, drawing 1,500 people shortly after Jessica's passing, demonstrating the profound impact her loss had on the town. Now, 24 years later, they finally had answers. But the perpetrator would never face trial. Alaska authorities announced the resolution with a sense of relief, tempered by the reality that Branch had escaped earthly justice. "We've solved a 24-year-old case," officials stated, acknowledging both the breakthrough and the limitations of posthumous identification. For Jessica's family and for Richard Bingham, whose life had been forever altered by a false accusation, the resolution was bittersweet. The truth had finally emerged, but at a cost that could never be fully calculated. If you've made it this far and enjoy deep dives into the most shocking criminal cases, hit that subscribe button and don't forget to press the bell icon. One perpetrator's dark confession would reveal chilling motivations. Lisa Ziegert. April 15, 1992, was an ordinary evening at a greeting card shop in Agawam, Massachusetts. 24-year-old Lisa Ziegert was working alone, managing the quiet store as she had done many times before. The shop was located in a safe, residential area where violent incidents were rare, making what happened next all the more shocking to the community. When Lisa's shift ended and she failed to return home, her family immediately sensed something was wrong. The card shop was found locked, but Lisa was nowhere to be found. 4 days later, Lisa's body was discovered in a wooded area several miles from the store. The investigation revealed she had been taken from her workplace, harmed, and stabbed. The case sent shockwaves through the peaceful town of Agawam, and investigators launched an intensive search for the perpetrator. Despite collecting physical evidence from the scene, including biological material, the investigation eventually stalled. The DNA profile sat in databases for years without a match, and Lisa's case joined the growing list of unsolved incidents that haunted law enforcement. For 25 years, Lisa's family lived with unanswered questions. Her mother never stopped pushing for answers, keeping Lisa's memory alive and maintaining pressure on investigators to continue pursuing leads. The breakthrough finally came in 2016, when advances in DNA phenotyping technology offered a new approach. Investigators worked with Parabon Nano Labs to create a composite sketch based on the DNA profile from the crime scene. The phenotyping process analyzes genetic markers to predict physical characteristics like eye color, hair color, skin tone, and facial structure, creating a visual representation of an unknown suspect. The composite sketch was released to the public, generating numerous tips. One of those tips led investigators to Gary Shara, a man who bore a striking resemblance to the DNA-generated image. Shara had been living a seemingly normal life in the area, and nothing in his background had previously connected him to Lisa's case. However, when investigators obtained a search warrant and collected DNA from his home, specifically from a toothbrush, the match was definitive. The DNA from the toothbrush matched the evidence from Lisa's case. What made this case particularly disturbing was what investigators discovered about Shara's state of mind. After his arrest in 2017, Shara wrote a series of confession letters that provided chilling insight into his motivations. In one letter, he stated, "I was fascinated by abduction and bondage from an early age," revealing that his actions were driven by long-held fantasies rather than any interaction with Lisa herself. He described how these thoughts had spun out of control and led to the events of that April evening. In his letters, Shara claimed he had no intention of ending Lisa's life and expressed regret that things had unfolded as they did. Interestingly, Shara had been going through a custody battle in 1992, and his ex-wife later revealed that she had suspected him at the time but never came forward to authorities. After his arrest, Shara attempted to take his own life but survived. In September 2019, he entered a guilty plea and was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. During the sentencing hearing, Lisa's family finally had the opportunity to address the man who had stolen their daughter's life and robbed them of 27 years of answers. Another California case would take even longer to solve. Robin Brooks. April 24, 1980, began like any other day in Sacramento, California. 20-year-old Robin Brooks was in her apartment, going about her daily routine in what should have been a safe, familiar environment. When Robin was discovered in her home, the investigation revealed she had been attacked and stabbed. The scene suggested the perpetrator had known where she lived and had specifically targeted her apartment, though the motive remained unclear in the immediate aftermath. The Sacramento Police Department launched a comprehensive investigation, interviewing neighbors, friends, and anyone who might have had contact with Robin. Physical evidence was collected from the scene, including biological material that would prove crucial decades later. However, in 1980, DNA analysis was not yet available as an investigative tool, and the case eventually went cold despite investigators' best efforts. Robin's family was left without answers, struggling to understand who would have targeted their daughter and why. What emerged during the investigation was a troubling pattern of behavior from one particular individual. Philip Lee Wilson had been obsessed with Robin and had repeatedly harassed her at her workplace. Co-workers reported that Wilson's attention toward Robin had been unwanted and persistent, making her uncomfortable. However, in 1980, the evidence connecting Wilson to the crime scene was not strong enough to pursue charges, and he was never arrested. For 40 years, Wilson lived freely while Robin's family waited for justice. The breakthrough came in 2020, exactly 40 years after Robin's passing, when investigators reopened the case using genetic genealogy. The biological evidence preserved from the scene was analyzed, and the resulting DNA profile was used to build family trees through public databases. The genealogical investigation led investigators back to Philip Lee Wilson, the same man who had been a person of interest 4 decades earlier. On the 40th anniversary of Robin's demise, Wilson was arrested and charged. The trial began in early 2022, and the evidence against Wilson was substantial. The DNA match was compelling, placing him at the crime scene. Testimony revealed that Wilson had been rejected by Robin and that his obsession with her had driven him to commit the act. His defense attorney attempted to argue that any biological evidence could have resulted from consensual contact. But the circumstances and the nature of the crime scene contradicted this claim. The jury initially deadlocked, unable to reach a unanimous verdict, forcing a mistrial. However, prosecutors immediately moved forward with a retrial. In the second trial, the jury was more decisive. In March 2022, Wilson was found guilty of Robin's demise. The following month, he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For Robin's sister, Maria Arik, the conviction brought an overwhelming sense of relief after 42 years of waiting. "I just never gave up hope," she told reporters, reflecting on the decades of uncertainty and the persistence required to see the case through to resolution. Robin's case highlighted how genetic genealogy could solve cases even when traditional suspects had been identified but never prosecuted due to lack of evidence. The technology provided the definitive link that had been missing in 1980, finally giving Robin's family the justice they had sought for more than 4 decades. Maria Arik stated that she could finally move forward with her life, knowing that her sister's case had been resolved and that Wilson would never harm anyone else. A bookstore would become the scene of another tragedy. Sherry Black. November 30th, 2010, was supposed to be an ordinary day at a small bookstore in South Salt Lake, Utah. Sherry Black, a 64-year-old woman who loved literature and ran the shop with her husband Earl, was working alone that afternoon. When Earl arrived to check on the store, he discovered a scene that would forever change his life. Sherry had been attacked in the store, beaten and stabbed in what appeared to be a spontaneous and brutal act. The bookstore, a peaceful place filled with stories, had become the setting for a real-life horror. The investigation revealed no signs of forced entry, suggesting that Sherry had allowed someone into the store or that the perpetrator had entered during normal business hours. Nothing of significant value appeared to be missing, ruling out robbery as a primary motive. The biological evidence collected from the scene indicated that Sherry had been harmed before being left in the bookstore. The randomness of the incident and the lack of an obvious motive made the case particularly difficult to solve using traditional investigative methods. For a decade, Sherry's case remained unsolved. Her husband Earl struggled with the loss, and the community mourned a woman who had been known for her kindness and her passion for books. The South Salt Lake Police Department continued working the case, preserving evidence and hoping that advancing technology would eventually provide answers. That hope was realized in 2020 when investigators turned to genetic genealogy. The DNA evidence from the scene was analyzed, and genealogists began building extensive family trees using public databases like GEDmatch. The process was painstaking, involving hundreds of hours of research to trace family connections and identify potential suspects. The investigation eventually led to Adam Durbarow, a man who had been 19 years old at the time of Sherry's demise. Durbarow had no prior connection to Sherry or the bookstore, and investigators learned that he had experienced a difficult upbringing without adequate support systems. When confronted with the evidence, Durbarow confessed to the act. He described it as a spontaneous decision rather than a premeditated plan, though his exact motivations remained somewhat unclear. In October 2021, Durbarow entered a guilty plea, and in February 2022, he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. During the sentencing hearing, Earl Black addressed the court, stating, "For 11 years, I've had to live without Sherry," describing the profound impact her loss had on his life and the lives of everyone who knew her. Sherry's case had a lasting impact beyond the courtroom. The resolution inspired Utah lawmakers to pass what became known as the Sherry Black Bill, legislation that established regulations for how DNA evidence can be used in criminal investigations. The law balanced the need for effective law enforcement tools with privacy protections for individuals whose DNA might be in public databases. For Earl and Sherry's family, the resolution brought a measure of peace, though the pain of her loss would never fully heal. One Illinois case would end without the perpetrator facing trial. Julianne Hanson. In July 1972, 15-year-old Julianne Hanson left her home in Naperville, Illinois, a quiet suburban community where families felt safe and children could move freely. When Julie's body was discovered, the investigation revealed she had been harmed and stabbed, sending shockwaves through a town unaccustomed to such incidents. The case became one of Naperville's most infamous unsolved crimes, haunting the community for nearly 50 years. The investigation in the early 1970s followed standard procedures for the era. Detectives interviewed potential witnesses, collected physical evidence, and pursued various leads. However, without modern forensic tools, the case eventually went cold. Police Chief Robert Marshall later described how the brutal crime had haunted the community for decades, with investigators never fully closing the file despite the lack of active leads. The evidence sat in storage, waiting for technology to advance enough to be useful. That advancement came in 2021, when investigators decided to apply genetic genealogy to Julie's case. The DNA evidence preserved from the scene was analyzed and uploaded to genealogical databases, where family trees were constructed to identify potential suspects. The investigation led to Barry Lee Welpley, a retired welder living in Minnesota. Welpley had no criminal record in Minnesota, had been married for years, and appeared to be living a quiet retirement. He had also lived near the scene in 1972, placing him in the area when Julie disappeared. When detectives approached Welpley, they subjected him to a 7-hour interrogation before providing his Miranda rights. The statements he made during this interrogation were later suppressed by the court, deemed inadmissible because they were obtained before he had been properly advised of his rights. Nevertheless, the DNA evidence was strong, linking Welpley to the crime scene through genealogical analysis of relatives whose DNA was in public databases. Welpley was arrested and extradited to Illinois to face charges. He entered a not guilty plea and was held in jail as he awaited trial. The legal proceedings moved slowly, with various motions and hearings delaying the trial date. Welpley's defense team sought to have him released on bail, citing his age and health conditions, but these requests were denied. As the case progressed through the court system, it appeared that Julie's family would finally have their day in court. However, in February 2024, Welpley was found deceased in his cell. The cause was reported as a heart attack, bringing an abrupt end to the legal proceedings before a trial could begin. With the defendant's passing, the case entered a state of limbo. There would be no trial, no guilty verdict, and no formal sentencing. Julie's family was denied the opportunity to see Welpley held accountable in court. Though the DNA evidence had already established his connection to the crime, some betrayals come from those closest to us. Linda Slayton. September 4th, 1981, was a day that would forever haunt Lakeland, Florida. Linda Slayton, a mother who had devoted herself to raising her family, was found in her home. The investigation revealed she had been harmed and strangled. and the circumstances suggested this was a targeted act rather than a random incident. What made this case particularly devastating for Linda's family was not just her loss, but the realization years later of who was responsible. Linda's sons were young when they lost their mother, growing up without her presence and struggling to understand what had happened. The investigation pursued various leads over the years, but without advanced forensic capabilities, the case went cold. Linda's sons never stopped wondering who had taken their mother from them. And as they grew into adulthood, they carried that question with them. One of the sons later recalled how the unsolved case affected every aspect of their lives, leaving a wound that never fully healed. The breakthrough came in 2019, nearly 40 years after Linda's passing, when investigators applied genetic genealogy to the case. The DNA evidence from the scene was analyzed and compared against genealogical databases. In a particularly ironic twist, the family trees that led investigators to their suspect were built partly using DNA from Linda's own sons, who had submitted their genetic information to ancestry websites years earlier, without knowing it would help solve their mother's case. The investigation led to Joseph Clinton Mills, and the revelation was staggering. Mills had been Linda's son's football coach, someone they had trusted and looked up to during their youth. Mills had been 20 years old at the time of Linda's demise and had subsequently built a stable life with a long-term marriage, children, and grandchildren. He had been a fixture in the community, appearing to be an upstanding citizen while carrying the secret of what he had done. To confirm the genealogical findings, investigators collected DNA from Mills's trash along with a palm print. The DNA match was conclusive, and the palm print also connected him to the crime scene. Mills was arrested, and the case that had haunted Linda's family for 4 decades finally had a suspect. The evidence suggested premeditation, with investigators theorizing that Mills had hidden in a closet waiting for Linda. During legal proceedings, Mills maintained that any contact with Linda had been consensual and denied taking her life. However, in 2022, he entered a guilty plea and was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. At the sentencing hearing, Linda's son addressed Mills directly with words that captured the family's anguish and anger. "You can't die and burn in hell fast enough," he told the man who had betrayed their trust in the worst possible way. The resolution brought justice, but also a profound sense of betrayal, knowing that someone they had admired and trusted had been responsible for their mother's passing all along. The final case would involve mysteries within mysteries. Lee Rotatori, June 25, 1982, unfolded in an Iowa hotel that would become the scene of a tragedy. Lee Rotatori, a 32-year-old woman staying at the hotel, was found deceased in her room. The investigation revealed she had been harmed and stabbed, and investigators immediately began working to identify who was responsible. What made this case unique was not just the tragedy itself, but the bizarre circumstances that would emerge, connecting it to another unsolved incident. The initial investigation examined the crime scene carefully. Investigators noted that the room was not in disarray and that robbery did not appear to be the motive, according to Captain Eldon Jones. This suggested that Lee Tia knew her attacker or that the perpetrator had a specific reason for targeting her beyond theft. Despite their efforts, investigators could not identify a clear suspect, and the case went cold. Lee's family was left without answers, wondering who would have targeted her and why. The case remained unsolved for 40 years until investigators decided to revisit it using genetic genealogy. DNA evidence from the scene was analyzed by Parabon Nanolabs, and genealogists began building family trees to identify potential suspects. The investigation led to Thomas O. Freeman, a truck driver who had lived near Cobden, Illinois. The genealogical evidence was strong, but investigators needed confirmation through a direct DNA sample. That confirmation came through an unexpected source: Freeman's daughter. Her DNA was tested and confirmed the familial relationship to the crime scene evidence, definitively identifying Freeman as the perpetrator. However, there would be no arrest, no trial, and no opportunity for Lee's family to confront him in court. Freeman himself had been deceased since 1982, having been shot and killed just weeks after Lee's demise. This revelation opened up an entirely new mystery. Freeman's own passing had never been solved, and the circumstances of his demise remained under investigation. Some investigators theorized that Freeman's own ending might be connected to Lee's case, potentially a revenge scenario or a silencing, though no definitive conclusions have been reached. A person of interest named Nemka has been discussed in connection with Freeman's case, but nothing has been proven. The resolution of Lee's case brought answers, but also raised new questions. Her family finally knew who was responsible for her passing, but they would never know Freeman's motive or why he targeted Lee. The connection between Lee's demise and Freeman's subsequent ending added another layer of complexity to an already tragic story. Freeman's own case remains officially unsolved, creating a situation where one victim's case has been closed while the perpetrator's own ending continues to be investigated. For Lee's family, the identification of Freeman provided some closure, even though many questions remain unanswered. Justice, in the traditional sense, was impossible to achieve. This was all from our side today. Thanks for watching. Click here to check out another video.